Okay. I always feel like it should be some like intro music fading in and out, and this kind of. Maybe that's what we should edit that in later. Some kind of like I don't know, some like futuristic electronica or something, just drifting in.
Night Rider theme. I'm feeling.
Maybe Knight Rider. Yeah. The copyright strike would be immediate, I'd imagine. But yeah, we don't actually have any intro music, but what we do have on this episode of Beautiful Game Theory is, as well as Alex Newby in British Columbia, David Farrock in Sheffield, we are joined by the one and only Dan Abrahams, and I'm going to give Dan the classic podcast intro now, just to try and embarrass him, and I'm going to read it off his website. Here we go. Dan Abrahams is a sports psychologist working alongside individuals, teams, coaches, and organizations globally. He is known for his passion to demystify sports psychology and for creating simple-to-use performance techniques. He is the author of 4 best-selling sports psychology books and is the founder of both the Dan Abrahams Soccer Academy and the Sports Psych Show podcast. A former professional golfer and PGA qualified, Dan has a first-class honours degree in psychology and a master's degree in sports psychology. Dan, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to Beautiful Game Theory. How are you?
I'm very well, Jamie. And as you mentioned there, I have written 4 books, which I enjoyed writing them immensely. And I think that mini biography that you've stolen off of my website there took me longer to write and was greater hardship than writing any of those books. It's always so difficult to write website copy. It's unbelievable. But anyway,
I think it flows nicely. That's the first time I've read it out loud, and I thought it flowed very nicely, Dan. So congratulations on that.
If you ever need any website copy written for yourself, then I'm a gun for hire.
The man's talents knows no bounds. This is becoming clear early on. So on the show, Dan, I don't know if you know, but I talk about a variety of things, I suppose, pertaining to. We are practicing coaches, and we are interested in, I think, how the way we think about the world that can influence our practice, right? Which, you know, where the rubber meets the road, where coaching practice is, and it's a crazy old place out there. It's the Wild West, and there's a lot of ideas, and there's a lot of theories, there's a lot of approaches, and it's difficult for coaches, absolutely myself included, to navigate, I think, through this vast milieu, right? It's tricky stuff, and I think, David, you wanted to maybe start by talking about the role that maybe empirical evidence and science plays in how we do this.
Yeah, just wanted to see what you thought about it seems like there's been an advance of empirical research, more sports science, more people earning degrees in that field. Just wanted to see kind of what you thought the division of labor should be, maybe between the academic, scientific, empirical research side, and maybe more of the intuitive and maybe even experience side.
I think it's a good start. I think it's a really interesting question, and it's very topical at the moment because obviously there's a group of coaches who are sort of globally affiliated, maybe to one particular coach who
you can say his name if you want that.
who very much promote the idea of the importance of, well, I don't know if they're promoting the idea of the importance of empirical evidence, because the word objectivity is used, and I think I understand there's objective information in every sport, and I think that's an important thing, to know that objective information and to utilize that objective information, although I'd always say that we experience that objective information subjectively. We can talk about that. Empirical evidence, I think, is another thing. I think what we try to do with empiricism is, the scientific method, we try to cut away biases, don't we? We try and cut away value-driven opinions, the experimenter's own bias, and so on and so forth. And there's people who are with far greater knowledge than me in that area. So I think there could be some confusion there between what is objective. Are we striving for objectivity within empiricism? Is that possible? Is empirical evidence objective? And all that jazz. I think just stripping this back for me, when you begin at the beginning, I always think of 3 E's, and I've kind of created this little model that actually over lockdown I've started to talk about with coaches. And the third E, I'm just actually going to write down now because I always forget the third E. How bad's that? But the first E is experiential. And by and large, I think that's where we start as coaches, especially in the world of football, where by and large, football coaches have played by and large, and by and large, and it's a generic broad brush statement, but they'll start in their coaching. The genesis of their coaching starts with how they were coached themselves, the conversations they might have with colleagues, everything that you can think of that would be experiential. And I think that that's by and large where coaches start. Then they start to build up their courses, and I think the experiential evidence increases because they're having conversations with coaches. So I think that's always going to be a big mainstay of things, and I personally don't have a problem with that, provided that they're reflecting and engaging in a process of critical appraisal. Again, we can talk more about that. But I think that's always going to be a big part of the pie. But I'm kind of envisioning a Venn diagram here, and I'm kind of bringing in the other E, which you've mentioned there, and that's what we want to talk about, is the empirical side of things. What does the research evidence say? But I also think that there needs to be a caution sign with the empirical evidence, because it's like, who's it by, how powerful is the study? Is the study backed up at all? When I did my master's degree, my sports psychology master's degree at Brunel University in West London, on my first day I walked in and I saw this putting mat, golf putting mat. And there were a couple of researchers with some participants, and they were doing a piece of research on putting. And you're just thinking, a putting mat indoors is so far removed from what you experience out on the golf course, no matter your level. The information hitting your retina, sensory information piling into your body, it's so different. And I'm not saying from that moment on, I'm just saying that was my first day in my master's degree. And I'm kind of thinking, well, how do I trust this research evidence? So I think when somebody says this is evidence-based, or read this research here, it's worth reading, because it's just like, is this representative of my environment? Whether it's contextual or what, who's participating in the experiment? Is it a bunch of students who can't play football, can't play golf? Who's participating in the research evidence? That said, I think it's very important that coaches, if they have the time, if they have the resources, that they engage in some study around empirical evidence. I'm not suggesting that that's not important. That is important. There's no doubts about that. And if you can be, to a degree, evidence-based in your practice, and obviously there can be experiential evidence as well, but if you can be empirically evidenced to a degree, that's useful. Because whether it's empirical evidence or whether we put those two together, when you've got those two, or you've got the empirical evidence in place, then you can critically appraise. You can have great conversations with your fellow coaches. And I think, having worked at the adult elite level, say Premier League football, being lead psych for England rugby, being lead psych for England golf, not enough of that happens. The conversations that coaches tend to have together tends to be around the experiential, and there's a lot of toing and froing and guesswork, whereas there's never really a lot of conversation around, well, this theory says this. What are we thinking with that related to what we did today? Could we bring a bit more? Do we have to shift that? So there's not enough conversation around empirical evidence as far as I'm concerned. So I would bring those two together. I'd like to put to coaches that we should have better, more informed conversations, and that requires the colliding of experiential empirical evidence. But I also think, I'm going to ramble on here, sorry. I also think, I think there's a great debate I say it's a great debate. It's actually regarded as a poor debate because half of the debating team didn't do very well. Stephen Fry and Jordan Peterson versus Michelle Goldman, and I'm going to forget his name, but it was an American academic and preacher. And they're talking about political correctness. And unusually, Stephen Fry and Jordan Peterson are together because they come from quite different political viewpoints. But they're together saying not so much political correctness has gone mad, but political correctness is suppressing ideas, thoughts, language, etc., etc. And Michelle Goldman and this other guy whose name escapes me, I do apologize.
Michael Dyson, I want to say.
Thank you. Well done. So there's a moment that I think Stephen Fry is great and fantastic, and obviously he's a great performer as well, so he performed amazingly well. But there was a moment towards the end where Stephen Fry just talks about, he said, the ghost hovering over my head comes from a letter that Oscar Wilde wrote to his lover, Bosie. And Bosie wasn't very educated and was a bit insecure about it. And Oscar Wilde wrote, "It's not that you didn't, you didn't get a degree, and that's not a problem with me. It's that through a lack of education, you don't have the Oxford manner." Is what it's called, the Oxford manner, which is essentially the ability to play gracefully with ideas, And I think that's brilliant, that notion of the ability to play gracefully with ideas, playing gracefully with ideas. And I think that brings in a third E for me. And that third E is exploratory. I think we have to play gracefully with ideas as coaches. I think we have to explore. And maybe when I worked with Eddie Jones at England Rugby, maybe I'd like to think he was quite good at that. He wasn't much into the empirical side, more into the experiential, but they explored ideas and stuff, which I thought was quite good. So I kind of picture a Venn diagram of three E's, three circles joining up, and in the middle is this sweet spot of conversation and this sweet spot of self-feedback and feedback in the group of coaches. And as long as there's psychological safety there, we can brainstorm around these three areas: experiential, empirical, and exploratory ideas. So that's my very long-winded and probably off-topic answer to your, what do you think of empirical evidence?
Really like the third E, the exploratory component. Given that my critique of maybe the empirical side is I think sometimes they take the game to be a static entity as opposed to something that evolves. So I like that idea of exploration, contributing to the evolution of the game, because it is a little bit of a question for me in terms of coaching. Different people play the game for different reasons. So then we have that question of convergence and divergence, and are we all aiming at the same thing? Should we all be aiming at the same thing? But then I would think most people would say it's reasonable to say some coaches are better than others.
Yeah. I think if I was to immediately respond to that, I think I just wonder if a lot of my experience, where I have a problem with coaches preaching from the pulpit of everything, either using the term everything has to be objective or empirical. Again, I get the importance of reading research papers. I don't think they're redundant, even in a dynamic environment. And I say that because as somebody, I suppose, who is, whether one calls it lucky or unlucky or blessed or whatever, to work at the coalface of the adult elite level, so in football, the Premier League, I've never had many conversations with coaches at that level where they're referring to empirical evidence. And I suppose I say that because I can understand why there's one person in all our minds right now who preaches from the pulpit of the importance of that. And maybe, just maybe, as you said, David, everybody has different backgrounds and experiences and wants and hopes and doubts and dreams, etc. We see the world through our own filters. And probably he, historically, 20, 25 years ago, got so fed up with these somewhat shallow conversations, perhaps, or conversations that lack empirical evidence, and just I think this, I think that, with any kind of deeper appreciation of what research might be out there. I can understand why he's gone off on that, in that direction, but I do wonder if the optimal frame of reference is always somewhere in between. I think as human beings, we tend to go on the right or the left, the black or the white, and we're not very good at staying in the shades of grey. We're not very good in staying in the middle. What feels more comfortable is to adopt a position, and I just wonder if the position needs to be in that centre ground. It's like, I know what my experiences are, and I appreciate that it's a dynamic environment, and everybody in this squad, there's 25 players, and everyone's going to see things differently. I need to have a look at the empirical evidence related to what we're talking about here and lend where we can, allow it to spark great conversation. And I think that's the thing I want to say is ultimately it's just about conversation in the room. I've yearned for years at the adult elite level to have great, like we're doing now, I suppose, have great conversations in a room with people, with coaches who were usually incredible players. Like, I'm pinching myself some of the times I'm in a room with 2-3 players who have had these illustrious careers, but then we're just talking about, well, back in my day, we did this rondo and we did this keep ball, and that's what we do. And ordinarily now the habit is, well, as a collective coaching staff, we go and watch Simeone at Atletico Madrid and watch where they're doing, or so on and so forth, or we go to AS Roma and watch what they're doing, and it's like, yeah, great, that's fantastic, we need to do that. That builds our experiential evidence, but we also need to look at the empirical and bring them together, and the dynamic, the dynamic conversation is in the dynamic between those two, plus the explore. Well, okay, and I think that's where you can explore is Diego Simeone is doing that at Atletico Madrid. That's awesome. Does that marry up with what we know about the research evidence, whatever that might be? Now, can we explore how we bring this together and bring it for our context right now in what we're doing? And can we improve it? What does better look like with that? What does better look like? And have those kind of conversations. Whereas I think, again, I'm conscious that I'm talking about the professional level here. I think they're very hypnotized with, well, what have we always done? And what does, as I say, Simeone do at Atletico? I'm using Simeone as a random example. What does he do? And that's where we're going to improve. But there's a better conversation to have.
Yeah, I think this idea of conversation itself is an interesting thing, and how people even would perceive or conceptualize what a conversation is. And for me, anyway, it's almost useful to think of it as this like mutually transformative experience, right? Shared experience. Where my goal when I go into the conversation is not to hammer home my point, right? Or and look, maybe at times, like, I like an argument as much as the next guy, right? And it's fun to do. It's fun to joust as well, no doubt. But there's genuinely meaningful conversations are the ones that, and I would say I would always approach the conversation this way, in the hope that I come out different, right? In the hope that I change. And I think, and even when that's watching a film or listening to an album or something like that, it's like, how do I know when I've seen a great film? It's difficult, but it's like, there's so you go and see those movies and you go, the summer blockbuster, right? Fill in the blank, whatever it is, box office smash, and you come out and you just think, you don't even think anything. You just go and go about your business. You go shopping or have a drink or whatever. You saw a movie, but then some movies you come out of and you're a different person. You're actually different. Or if it's a book you've read, right, or a song you've heard, experience you've had, person you've met, and you're you're different. The way you see the world, right, is different, and it's almost, you can't undo that to a certain extent. You can build on it and keep changing it. But yeah, I think just this idea of approaching a conversation in that way, of this almost hope, and sometimes it's a forlorn hope, most of the time it is, that you're going to come out of it with this transformational aspect, and maybe that's something. And I'm going on rambling here, but I agree. I like with so much of what you say, because, and it's maybe tied to something I think about a lot as well. Is this? There seems to be, and I speak generally, within coaching, without coaching. You mentioned, some political discourse as well that's happening at the moment, and it's like there seems to be a deep uncomfortableness with uncertainty, and this uncertainty itself, and people, like you said a couple of times, want this comfort, right? It's easier to take a position. It's easy. I want this. Simeone does it. That's the box, right? Easy. I'm just going to apply this because it's certain, right? And it doesn't involve. I'm saying that certainty is this rigid thing, right? It doesn't necessarily involve this transformative aspect to it. And yeah, I think that when I see someone like Verheijen, like, as much as I think, fair enough to a certain extent, like, nice work, and it can be useful. It's this rigidity, right, to the ideas, and this all-encompassing view that I have I don't like it, and it's like, whoa, I have this kind of almost like visceral kind of reaction to it. So yeah, and I wonder if this idea of maybe coaches being more comfortable with uncertainty to allow that growth is a useful way to look at it.
Look, a couple of things I've written down as you're speaking, Jamie, and things I've reflected on as you're speaking there is, number one, what is coaching? What is it to be a coach? And when we're having these conversations, you picked up on the word conversation, which I just think is so important. And not every coach is blessed with having a number of coaches around them, but again, in my world, we are. And it's who's in the room. Who's in the room? Who's the expert? I mean, there's the question. And if we come back to the empirical evidence, who's the expert? Does the expertise lie in the text, or does the expertise lie in the protagonists? And the protagonists are the players, right? Because as you would attest to, David, as you said, the dynamism, of the situation, the individuality of perception. The different lenses, the 25 different lenses that are experiencing your coaching culture. Who's the expert? It's a little bit of a bold statement to suggest that the expertise lies in the text. Equally, it's a bold statement to say it lies in the experiences you've had as a coach. Equally, it's a bold statement to say it lies in the combination of both. I think there is expertise there, and there's nothing wrong with building a lot of knowledge. I think coaches need to have a lot of knowledge. Let's say knowledge is experiential, and let's say knowledge is empirical. I'm half laughing because I don't think knowledge is factual theory, as our friend mentioned on another podcast somewhere. I think that. But I think who's having that conversation? I think knowledge lies in those players as well. Again, certainly at the level I'm coaching, being the sports psychologist at. So what is it to coach? Is it to have knowledge, and is it to impart knowledge on players? Well, in part, it is, absolutely. I don't think one can dismiss that, although I think there may be a group of coaches who are very, very bottom up and very much about player experience, and would say it is, or would lend that way. I think it's a mix of both. And again, my experience is at the level that I'm a sports psychologist at, I think that other than England rugby, I can't think of any experience where there's been a great deal of integration of player knowledge, player experience, and the use of players when it comes to turning up the volume of certainty, brainstorming ideas, finding solutions. So there's that, and we can have a conversation about that, and it'd be interesting to get the opinion of you guys. I think the other thing I was thinking of there when you were speaking is, what is it to be a coach educator? What is it to be a coach educator? And let's bring this uncertainty certainty dichotomy up. Is being a coach educator to walk into the room and give people certainty? And if it is, how are we doing that? Are we just standing at the front and delivering something, again through the prism of our own world, our own eyes, or is it actually to ask questions, to help people explore their uncertainty, to tap into their curiosity, to challenge them to go away and find out their own unique answers to their own context, and what suits them. Is it not to give them any answers, or even to not get them to find any answers, but just to, again, have a conversation? What is it to be a coach educator? Does a coach educator need to take sides? Does a coach educator need to be somebody who works from one single framework or theory, or should a coach educator be a little bit more agnostic about it, and not wed themselves to a sort of a single ontological viewpoint, essentially? I think that's fascinating. I don't really have an answer, and I don't mind if somebody says, I love information processing, it's got to be this way. I love ecological dynamics, I've got to be, because I'll sit in a room and be fascinated by it. Just don't bully me into it. So just don't bully me into it. Just let's have a conversation. That's what I would say.
Yeah, so I'm curious, Dan, sorry, Jamie, didn't mean to cut you off. I'm curious that, having studied psychology and sports psychology, one of the interesting things I get from Nietzsche is to look at the psychology behind the philosophy, so the philosopher behind the philosophy. And I'm curious, with this conversation about conversation and about dialogue and about objectivity and dualisms and dichotomies, and Jamie, you talked about it, the scientific method, and also this dealing with certainty and uncertainty. I'm curious why you think, Dan, that some coach educators then feel the need to create these distinctions that are alienating and that don't allow for these different voices to come out. From a psychological perspective, why maybe it is the rise of scientific method, the value that empiricism has played in the last little while?
I think it's a really good question. I think what motivates an individual to behave in a certain way, to put themselves out there in the world in the way that they do. And obviously, we're just talking about the coaching world. It could be any world, I suppose. Why do people behave as they do? And I think, look, it can be as crass an answer as, if I'm black and white about things, if I want to take a specific position, and that position, and I shout that position loudly, and I say everybody else is rubbish and I'm great, everything else is rubbish and my position is right, then I think we attract attention. And if we're bold enough and brave enough, and this is one thing I've learned when I've taken people on in the past, that I'm possibly not disagreeable enough, hence I'm not bold enough and brave enough to shout too loudly, because that's incredibly uncomfortable to me, then more power to you, and you can have a big impact. Again, there's one person I'm thinking of in particular, but again, I come back to that particular personality dynamic there, Alex, is maybe you've got to be that particular type of person who feels comfortable enough to be able to take that specific position and go, rah, this is what I think. So I think there's an element of a trait of agreeableness there. I think there are other traits as well. I think, obviously, I'm coming to personality science, that I know that maybe this is something we wanted to veer onto, but I think that there's something about, what am I trying to say here? There's, within personality, if we take, say, a trait of openness to experience, I think there are people who, if they measured high on openness, they would be more inclined to see the world as incredibly complex, less rigid, less lines, much more open. They see the world different to people with low openness, who are much more routine-like, rigid. And I think that matters. I think that makes a difference to our behavioral expressions of our personality. I think it makes a difference to what we like within coaching. I think people who like rigidity and lines and boxes probably are more inclined to go towards empirical evidence, because that feels comfortable, that's boxed off. Well, what's the evidence there? Whereas I think people who might be on the not necessarily completely on the other end of the spectrum, but just a little bit different, just a bit more high open, would deal with that chaos and sort of see the world much through greater complexity. So I wonder if, to sum up what I'm saying two things, and maybe you can offer up something, Alex. I think definitely there's a prime motivation, especially in the world of coaching. Who am I? What am I trying to sell? Or not who am I? What am I trying to sell here? What am I trying to sell, and how am I trying to sell it? That's the reality of life, right? So I think there could be an instrumental strategy by which people use that drives how they go about coach education. But also, I think there is a personality thing. I do think, and I said this recently on Twitter, if I think about, say, Raymond, if I may say, I definitely see somebody who's low agreeable, who can go to the nth degree and won't get bullied. I think that there is somebody there who's probably a little bit more low open, likes boxes, likes, come on, what are the objective references here? We have to do everything with relation to those objective evidence references, because that makes sense to me. Why would it not make sense? There's 11 players. The pitch is this. Are these dimensions, the objective is the game of this, and that sounds very lovely and very nice and very neat, and that does to me as well, and I get why that's important. I'm not saying that that's not important, but then when it comes to the craft of coaching, well, those objective references might be important and neat, but how we experience them can be chaotic and very variable across individuals and across time frames and things like that. So I just think personality gets in the way here. Who we are we're very different, but we have typical responses. So I wonder if it's what drives us and who we are would be the two ways I'd see that, Alex.
Yeah, that just as a quick response, that makes a lot of sense to me. And as a coach educator for local community courses in my own area, it's also something interesting in terms of how I would deal as a coach educator with the people that I'm trying to help facilitate their knowledge, because they're also going to come with their own ideas, their own personality traits. And I want to try and develop a sense of conversation, a sense of dialogue that is more or less open. But yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And it makes sense that people with low degrees of agreeableness and that are less open would be less committed to conversation, I think.
And absolutely. And you immediately, when you see your community, of course, look, our mesosystems and our macro systems make a difference. Macro system being, in North America, not everybody, but the prevailing culture in sport can be top down, from NFL, NBA, coaches on the sideline, motivators, cheerleaders, messages across the college system. You can control your attitude, effort, and energy. You bring that to the table, to the court, the course, the pitch. I can't produce that for you. Well, we know you can through tasks and through challenges and what have you. But anyway, that tends to be the mesosystem and the macro system that goes around sports in North America, for instance. It's not that egalitarian. It's much more competitive than cooperative, and so. That obviously influences as well. So yeah, I just wanted to add that. Thanks, Alex.
If I could jump in real quick, one thing that was coming to my mind was we're speaking about knowledge and experience, but I think, or one way I think it's been described is propositional statements or propositional knowledge, but then also there being the sense of perspectival knowledge. Which I would think as a sports psychologist is probably something that you work with a lot. And maybe that is where some of the personality models come in. Because thinking back, in my time as a player, I would wish that, I would have been able to do some breath work and some meditation, all these things. And it may have, maybe I would have been more relaxed or something. But thinking about it, it's a little bit beyond the level of things that I would have known. It's more of just like the whole who I was as a person at that point in time reacted, in a certain range given the day and all that. But, that would be different than how I would react to that situation now, 10 years later. and I would think that's similar with coaching as well. There's just something, I don't want to say maybe that's irreducible, but it's just like the person that you are is going to always be the biggest determinant. It seems like that to me, at least. So I'm guessing, is that something that you feel like you try to help people understand with the personality stuff?
Yeah, definitely. I think, look, when you strip it back, the integration of psychosocial, I think, is so important rather than the isolation, which is challenging, say, at grassroots level, and requires the coach, him or herself, to go away and be a student and to try to make sense of the psychosocial literature out there, or the experiential psychosocial stuff. I think, what I'm trying to do as a sports psychologist, I'm trying to do a lot of things, but one of the things I'm trying to do is help people to understand themselves better, to explore themselves, essentially. And that might involve some kind of structured form. That might involve, say, a personality test like an NEO, maybe. But worst way, one can always come back to what we might hypothesize to be the most efficacious sort of structure of personality, the 5-factor model. But just to have, again, this word, conversation with somebody and ask the pertinent questions to help them reflect on who they are and how they engage in their world and how they behave in certain situations. I would also add there that my job is to help the coaching staff in the organizations that I engage with, or the coaches I engage with, is to help them to have better conversations about who their players might be. And I think that that's where the personality literature can be useful. And I really want to make it clear, I'm not suggesting personality, whether you look at the work of Colin de Jong and you think about it on a trait and a character adaptation level, so 2 levels, whether you take the work of Dan McAdams at Northwestern University and you see it on 3 levels, which is traits and character adaptations and narrative identity, however you see it, I think that some knowledge of the 5 traits can be useful for coaches, because even though we can't say, well, this is this person's personality per se, because personality is dynamic. Nobody denies that. I don't think there's any personality theorist or scientist on the planet who would say otherwise. What can be useful for coaches, and I think for me, maybe where coaching, certainly at the adult elite level, the professional level, needs to go, is a greater understanding of those 5 traits. Because there's so many conversations behind the scenes about, in inverted commas, difficult players. And that's probably somebody who's on the low agreeable side of things. The trait of agreeableness. Great, let's start there. Let's not start with this player's a difficult, and I'm working at a level where difficult players who have a great deal of skill in their feet will be moved on from a club, even though they're bought for £20 million. It's like, that's great asset management, isn't it? You just feel that, well, hold on, we need the coaching skill. We need, number one, better conversations here. Okay, we're hypothesizing, we're thinking that this player is low agreeable. Let's look at the evidence there. Well, he doesn't like being coached. He likes his idea of being coached, or his or her idea of the game and how he or she sees the world with relation to the game. Okay, let's look at that. This person doesn't like going and doing group activities. This person keeps themselves to themselves. This person starts arguments. All these things, we need to have a conversation about this. We need to have what we might call a psychologically informed environment, a PI, psychologically informed environment. Now, a PI is taken from homelessness services in the UK, which basically around about 2 decades ago. It was developed by a researcher and a psychologist because they felt the conversations around homeless people were quite binary. It was either a conversation around environment, the environment's the problem, or the psychology of the person is the problem. And they didn't, believe it or not, the two weren't intertwined. So they developed this idea of psychologically informed environments, whereby we have a conversation, social services have a conversation about these homeless personal people in our care who we're looking after. We're having a more robust conversation. We have psychological skills to be able to help these people. I think sport needs to be, sporting organisations, Arsenal, Spurs, Liverpool, Manchester United, they need to have pies, psychologically informed environments. They need to have better conversations amongst themselves about their players. They need psychological safety in the room to be able to have really robust conversations. I think this person is tough, is difficult, right? We're not going to psychologically test them. We're not going to do an NEO. We're not going to do that, the gold standard personality test. But we can see that this person keeps themselves to themselves. They get into a few arguments. They're low agreeable. Okay, right. How are we going to deal with this person? And then we talk about the coaching skills that are important to be able to deal with this person. So we talk about rather than insisting, which leads to resistance, insistence leads to resistance. We talk about coaching through questioning. We talk about empowering that player, or giving that player to have an opportunity to come up with their own solutions, empathizing with that, finding little pockets of areas to challenge that player, helping them set their own goals, helping them become accountable for those goals and objectives, just finding ways to say, okay, look, you're low agreeable. That's fine. We're putting you in charge of your situation. We're going to facilitate that process. We're going to monitor it, and we're going to find a way to hold you accountable for that. Not just, well, this person's difficult. They're not listening to what I'm saying, so they're not for this environment. Off you go. That to me isn't good enough. And that to me is where a basic understanding of the traits can help. If you have a person who tends to be introverted, so what introversion means, it's not necessarily about sociability, it's about enjoying rewards, just enjoying rewards actually, but mainly rewards are in your environment. So introversion, extroversion tends to be about sociability, but isn't completely about sociability. It's also about asserting yourself on your environment. If somebody is introverted, they're probably not too keen to go canoeing with the group to build social cohesion. They might behave in a certain way. They might not go. That's okay. We have to build in mechanisms that deals with that. And so on and so forth. We can talk about the traits and the relevance there. But that's, I hope I've answered your question. But I think we need cultures, again, certainly at the professional level, that are far more robust with dealing with individual differences. I really, really believe that. I really believe that there are clearly some people who are so far on the margins of personality traits on the scales that they are incredibly difficult. And sometimes you've just got to go, hey, look, you're not going to be for us. I'm not saying that never happens. I do think these organizations at the top level, and I've been in amongst them, just need to be a bit better at broadening their skill set to be able to deal with people who are further away from the margins. And that includes their staff as well. I'm introverted. I test quite heavily introverted. And that surprises people because I can stand on the stage with 1,000 people in front of me. I can do things like this and express myself. But that's not what it's about. It's just that social situations exhaust me. Clearly, I'm going to go and get 10 hours sleep as soon as I've finished with you guys, right? But it's that welfare and wellness and that psychologically informed environment need to stretch to the staffing as well. The coaches themselves, they need help on this. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that actually dovetails nicely into a question that I had, which was, so a few weeks ago, this webinar series had Richard Shuttleworth on, and he spoke about his experience with England rugby. And you talked a little bit about culture and getting to know the individuals. And I was hoping maybe you could give some insight into that, because he'd mentioned how individual clubs were setting culture interventions, but then when they come to England rugby, it was about being yourself. And so I'm curious how you described all these differences in people, how you maintain authenticity when also trying to develop a culture, and if you have some insight into what happened there with Eddie at England rugby.
Well, I worked closely. Let me actually change what I was about to say. I worked with Rick at England Rugby. I would have liked to have worked with him closer, but that wasn't the nature of how England Rugby do that with their staff, which is fine. I think, and please come back at me, Alex, if I'm not quite answering your question with accuracy. I think that in any international setup, and I've been involved with a few international setups, there's always an enormous challenge in terms of individual. If we were going to use that term mesosystem, I might be abusing that term. I might be using this wrongly, but the culture around the player at any given time, the person at any given time, if they're coming from that mesosystem at their club, say Gloucester Rugby, or I don't know, Wasps or Saracens or somewhere, they're coming from there and they're coming into England. They're going to be so used to the day-to-day culture that that they experience at their clubs. And so the challenge for Eddie and his coaching staff is to try to create a unified feeling around the international team. And I mean, one thing that when I was there, which I'm sure nobody would care that I say, because I'm sure probably Eddie's on record of, in terms of telling people what he did here, was that, one time he got all of the players to bring their club shirt with them, and he got them to put their England shirt underneath the club shirt, and we were all standing around, and he got the players to look at each other, and he was like, look at everybody, they're all wearing different shirts, you're all wearing different shirts, some of you have got Saracen shirts, some of you have got Leicester shirts, and so on and so forth. And then he said, right, I want you to take off your shirts, and took them off, and then they've got the England shirts underneath. And obviously, look, it's a very simple thing, isn't it? But it's just emphasizing that he wanted a shared mental model around what they were doing in England. And it's an interesting juxtaposition. If one can perceive that to be, that's kind of facile, that's quite simple. But if you actually think back to, there's a fairly insightful interview between Jake Humphrey and three ex-England players, Steven Gerrard, Frank Lampard and Rio Ferdinand, and they're talking about the culture at England football during the golden era, the golden team, whatever they call them. And, they're just talking about, how Frank Lampard is going, well, Rio's my mate to a degree, but I was a Chelsea player and we're suspicious of Rio because he's Manchester United, and we're suspicious of we're both suspicious of Steven Gerrard because he's at Liverpool, and there was no shared identity created. And I suppose this comes under the remit of the theory of social identity theory. Great work by Dr. Matt Slater at Staffordshire University on this, and it's helping players feel like there's something bigger than their own identity, and it's shared amongst them all. So it's interesting what you said about Rick saying that they just wanted them to be themselves. Now, I was with England Rugby for a year. I left, and then Rick, I know, stayed on for another couple of years. I don't know if he's still there. He might be, I'm not sure. I don't think he is, but that might have changed. But my interpretation at that time was that there was an attempt to have a real shared identity, a shared feeling around the place. So I'm not, whether I'm misunderstanding what you're saying, Alex, or whatever. My interpretation at the time was it wasn't come and be yourself. I think it was more, we're going to sell to you what England looks like and what England feels like, and we want to be together, and we want to shred the skin of our club teams and be England together. We're going to work together. I mean, they did a lot of group work and a lot of mini group work and player-driven activities that felt very much about creating a cohesive unit of small cohesive units. That was my impression at the time. I mean, I was brought in to do some leadership stuff, so to help Neil Craig, the head of performance, and just not even be involved with the leadership meetings, just give him some advice and some ideas, and just to be on hand for the players if they wanted to work with me, which is fine. I believe that every single player needs a mental skills framework. I believe a mental skills framework needs to be shared for it to be effective in a team sport. So I personally wouldn't recommend teams do it in that way, but that's the way that England wanted me to work, which is fine. You know, you go with that or you don't go with that, and I decided, you know, I chose to go with that, and it was a really enlightening, interesting year where I learned a lot. All I can add is that the challenge for England rugby is based on that social identity, because when you play Wales and you play Scotland and you play Ireland and to a degree France, but especially the home nations, Wales, Ireland and Scotland, there is something about the social identity of those countries within rugby that take them on to an aggressive and a level of aggression that improves their game. And that is the big problem that England rugby have got. England rugby have a big problem, because, I'm saying that they've had that problem for years because of the national rivalries, because there's something about, and Jamie can fill us in here, there's something about playing England when you're Welsh, Scottish or Irish that gives you a level of instrumental aggression. And we could relate this to the Netflix series, the Michael Jordan one, what's it called?
Last Dance, right?
Last Dance. The instrumental aggression that Michael Jordan is able to summon up through finding someone to dislike and to seek revenge on. Remember, low agreeableness is this personality trait or a side of personality that is the aggressive side. It's like when you watch a documentary, a David Attenborough documentary, and you're watching chimpanzees tear monkeys to pieces. It's the aggressive side of nature. There is something that Michael Jordan can do, something about him that enables him to create a kind of instrumental aggression rather than reactive aggression. Reactive anger or aggression is neuroticism. That's where somebody does something to you and you're bang. Okay, it's reactive. Instrumental is, I hate you so much, or I hate this situation so much, that I am going to attack you extremely aggressively. And we feel, to the testosterone flows and our capacity to be physically incredible, however you want to put it, increases. There is something about that situation that renders it a big problem for England. That is my theory and complete hypothesis, but that's what I experienced when I was there. Which got so off your point, Alex. I do apologize.
No, I love it. I love it.
But I think that Michael Jordan thing is fascinating because there's something in that.
Yeah, I think, this is good stuff, right? This is fascinating stuff, and I think that maybe it's good to, at this point, you mentioned let's have a deeper dive in this idea of culture, right? And like, what actually are we talking about with culture? And it's like, you mentioned so many interesting things there, and maybe just one of the more recent things there that you were saying towards the end was this idea of Scotland, for example, have this there's the revenge, right? It's the old enemy, Braveheart, etc. But like, this is narrative, right? This is pure narrative, and narrative, I would say, is essentially narrative and culture are kind of entwined, right? It's like, so this idea of culture, as far as I understand it, it's human made, right? Culture, it's not, it can be linked, I think, with the natural world, and absolutely. I think this idea of what we talk about culture. It's like you talk about, we want to create a culture here, right? And we want to create it, right? We want to bring it into being, right? So then it's this idea of, okay, it's this creative process then, this human creative process of culture. What is culture? There's lots of different definitions, right? It's sort of governing norms, behaviors, beliefs, shared beliefs, something like this. Okay, so it's like I have to bring these elements, and there's infinite, other ones, into existence, right? And to be embodied, right, by people as well. And this is like, whoa, okay, this is heavy, man, right? Because then you're right, and this is why I think it's so cool when you talk about this, the PI, right, the psychologically informed environment, because if you've got, and you mentioned as well, you said something, coach, what are you trying to see? Everyone's got their own thing to sell, right? And it's like, maybe sell, but to some extent, right? It's like, I've got my narrative, right? I've got my culture, and you're trying to sell it to the players, right, or the organization, and the fans and whatever. You see this like on Twitter or any club, Mia Sam Mia, or whatever the little logo or slogan they have, right? This is like cultural implementation, right? This is what they're doing, and like, okay, so you need to understand who you're talking to, right? Because different methods of narrative, of communication are going to be more effective to different people, right? To get your overriding message or narrative or culture across. And I think that, like, you talk about different cultures, right? New Zealand rugby, different rugby within football as well. And something I think about a lot is, I think there's a lot of like talk about how effective is your culture or something like that. Does it help you win the games, or whatever? And like, that's true. Okay, we're in sports, so that's obviously important. But is there something, and you mentioned as well right at the beginning, elegance, right? Playing with ideas elegantly. I think elegant was the word you used, I think. And that's super important to me, right? This idea that, is there something about certain cultures are more elegantly put together than others, right? And there's an aesthetic quality to culture, I would say. And I think that is super important. I think of something like New Zealand All Blacks being a very aesthetically pleasing and affective culture, right? It does something. Not on a literal level, right? It's something more. There's something going on there, which is powerful. And I wonder if, I think it might be a good idea to maybe talk about coaching in that aesthetic way, and say, look, is there an elegance to the way you're putting together this team? Is there an elegance to the narrative that you're giving? Is there an elegance to the way that you're communicating it, understanding the people you're giving it to? Is there an elegance in the way that you've informed it with all different types of information from all different paradigms, and you've managed to get this kind of arrangement, right, that seems to be harmonious, and then can actually manifest what you might call something beautiful on the field, right? And this idea, well, we don't know what we mean when we talk about beauty, especially in football. It's a beautiful goal, right? This is an easy thing to say, but there is something about that, and I wonder if that shift towards a more artistic interpretation of coaching might be useful in maybe even a coach education setting. I don't know.
I love everything you've just said, and in many respects, as you're speaking now, I kind of feel I've written another book here, because it's like, because I'm thinking there as you're speaking, I'm thinking, you're talking about narrative, you're talking about culture. I would always define culture as what we say and what we do. However, when you were speaking, I wrote down the word deep. And by that I mean a deep culture. We want to have a deep culture, because what we say and what we do always feels kind of at the surface. And I think sometimes that's where, a good friend of mine, Dr. Scott Goldman, who I've interviewed quite a bit on my own podcast, talks about not using the word culture because he just thinks it's, I can't remember what the word he uses, but he doesn't like things like growth mindset and this, that, and the other, because they're things that not so much they come and go, they're just, I don't know, not mainstay psychological principles, if you like. And maybe culture is, and maybe he's being a bit harsh, but I just wonder if sometimes we use this word culture, it floats around global sport, not just British sport, but global sport. And I kind of feel we do it to a skin deep level. It's at the surface, what we say and what we do. And listening to you there, I'm thinking of a deep culture. And you hit the nail on the head when you said they're embodied. And I really like when one of our sort of behind the scenes conversations and we were critiquing a particular Dutch coach who and you said it's just so disembodied. It's just so disembodied. And I loved that. And it was just like, it was a real, you'll be pleased to hear, Jamie, it was a real kind of, yeah, wow. There was a real aha moment for me because it is so disembodied. And that's where coaching doesn't work. And that's where David empiricism doesn't work. It's so damn disembodied. It's so damned impersonal a lot of the time, not all the time with empirical evidence, because I get that the embodiment can be within the words and within the ideas, but you've got to embody what we say and what we do. So if culture is saying and doing, we've got to embody those things. We've got to be them. I suppose people talk about living the behaviors at the top of elite sport. We live our behaviors, but there's something about really living your behaviors. And there's something about, if we come back to that rugby example, Wales, Scotland and Ireland, when they go in to play England, there's something about embodying that culture of, if I may say, you've oppressed us for years. And there's something endemic in that rifles through. And that kind of in a way makes me sad because I love Welsh and Irish people, and Scots people aren't too bad either. Joking. I think that when we talk about words, I've been in that environment at England Rugby where, we're using words and talking about wanting to win in simple terms and talking about the process and wanting to do it and saying it with passion. And maybe even training with passion and training hard, but there's just something deeper there, that embodiment. And whether it's the social identity that helps, and again, if you talked about New Zealand rugby, there's something about, obviously there's books and texts on this now, which I think they're great stories, a lot of them, and they're not all 100% true, because there are challenges within New Zealand rugby, like there are challenges across all sports teams and international teams and sports organisations, but they do really embody and what it is to have that culture, and that's in part why they're so good. They're also very athletically good, but let me say this. One of the things I felt the last couple of years working in a medical department at a Premier League team and working with a lot of individuals dotted around the Premier League. Let's take, as we're speaking now, Liverpool are regarded the best side, whether Manchester City come back up. There's something about Liverpool playing Liverpool. And there's something about, let's come back to narrative, Jamie. There's something about the narrative. When you're in that medical department, you experience a narrative. And that narrative, say at the moment with Liverpool, we're playing Liverpool. And there's something said and unsaid about Liverpool are Liverpool, not just because Liverpool have great players. Liverpool are Liverpool because people perceive them to be Liverpool. And there's something about this is Anfield. There's something about Jurgen Klopp. There's something about the Kop. There's something about the history. There's something about Anfield itself. There's just something about their embodiment that when you go and play them, you're on the back foot rather than the front foot. You're with fear rather than with freedom. You're striving not to lose rather than to win, not just because they've got good players, but because the narrative around Liverpool creates the fear. The narrative around Liverpool creates. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is that's a point in itself, which I think is interesting. Players have narratives and groups of players have narratives, and it influences how they play. But it's also, if we look at Jurgen Klopp, and he's much celebrated, and I'm a bit cynical when it comes to celebrating managers, because I mean, geez, I remember when we celebrated how genius Fabio Capello was because England didn't lose a game for 14 games or something, qualified easy for 2010, and he's the best in the world. And subsequently, everybody's realised that actually it was a pretty maladaptive environment, and it didn't work out. So I'm not one of these people who would go, Jurgen Klopp amazing. I don't know Jurgen Klopp. I've not been in that environment. I have worked with some players in that environment. I've been fortunate in that respect. But there's something about him, his personality, and what he's been able to do to change that culture, and just the depth he's been able to get. He's gone into a deep culture change. He's gone deep with his culture. I'm struggling to come up with what the term, but it's a deep culture, Jamie. It's an embodied culture. It's not just saying and doing, because every team does that. They say and do the behaviors they want, the values that they want, and they don't embody it. And it's that embodiment that I think is important. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think I really love it. It's what I've written here is it's got to be believable. It's got to be believable, and it's got to be embodied. And when it's believable and it's embodied, and if you're a coach and you can make it believable and you can help players embody what your values and what you're trying to do and the behaviors, then it becomes a feeling. And science doesn't do well with feelings. I spoke to Steve Magnus about this. It just doesn't do well with it. It doesn't like feelings. So that's that side of it. And I don't know if every coach can be believable. And I don't know in all aspects. And I don't know if every coach can embody, help players embody these things to create a certain feeling. So, yeah, I think I just want to say that.
Thing is, I've got such a small notepad and wrote so many fucking things, so I can't even read anything anymore. So, David, you said you want to say something on narrative there.
Yeah, so I really like what you're saying with the narrative, and just taking that example of the England and Wales, Scotland, Ireland, and those other countries, they have a kind of an inbuilt narrative that's a very deep one, and obviously that can be a very intense competitive setting, right? But my kind of reading the tea leaves just across sport in general, it feels like maybe the narrative around some of the intensity is broken down. And I think I'm very earnestly trying to figure out what parts of it are just now there's maybe a loss of the narrative that used to hold up some of the more intense parts of the game that now are more liable to be interpreted as being toxic or too much. So I just wondered what you thought about the role of narrative there. Just thinking about, it seems like this is something that's coming across youth sport, but also even at the professional levels, you hear a lot more players speaking out about mental health and stuff, which is obviously great. So I think I'm sometimes just trying to figure out how this all fits together.
Yeah, I think, and I hope I'm going to answer your question correctly or adequately. I suppose if we think of narrative, we think of, I love the word narrative. I think with regard to your question, I just wonder if some people might go, well, it's cultural practice, it's coaching practice. It's what do we do within our coaching practice in order to help players, sorry, my laptop's going bananas, help players experience a culture that is participative, that helps them progress, that helps them perform. Mm-hmm. That hits the sweet spot between stretch and support. I think where the toxic cultures come in, the maladaptive cultures come in, is the coaching practices, the organizational culture, the narrative becomes skewed in the direction of stretch. And actually probably stretch is the wrong word. It's just the coaching practices are maladaptive. They're just too much shouting, bullying. I mean, there's actually something I think it came out today. Was it Texas Tech basketball, the women's team? There's been 5 players on their exit interview. 5 or 6 players made a complaint against the coach. And I think that I actually think, David, it's more directed towards bad coaching practice. I think it's a misunderstanding of how to stretch players, of how to help them progress to a position that is enormously competitive, how to help them be the best that they can be. I think Western culture, because I don't want to keep targeting North American sport because that's deeply unfair. I think British sport is endemic in British sport as well. Stretch is seen through the lens of bullying behaviours. I've got to shout to stretch players. I might have to be physical. I might have to do the kind of physical challenges that could be construed as bullying, that increases burnout, decreases well-being. So I think that it's coach knowledge. Back to knowledge. It's understanding efficacious ways of helping players get better, stretch themselves. I think that, and I think, the narrative comes from the culture. The narrative I'm trying not to come back to North American sport, basketball, base, and NFL, but it is this show, and it is about getting wound up, and it is about attitude, energy, and effort. And it's stop. No, it's not. That's not. It's about helping players develop skill. It's about helping players develop skill under pressure. It's about developing behaviors that help players become resilient. It's about understanding the nuances of cognition, motivation, emotion, and behavior, and how they work in parallel, and they're all thrown in together. And how can we help players manage those things? How can we help players develop mental skill? How can we help players manage their character? How can we help them understand their character? What helps them? What hinders them? I think those are the coaching practices and the processes within those coaching practices that are important. And I think it's important to keep educating coaches to be able to have optimal coaching practice to help players do that. So I think the coaching practice and the narrative are weaved in together. What else would I like to say there? I think that I come back to psychologically informed environments. I think there's a misunderstanding around vulnerability, and this is psychological safety. Again, I've worked in so many environments at the adult elite level, at the professional level, where it's just about posters adorning the gym with these quotes that players attenuate to the second time that they've seen them. I mean, they just ignore them now. I kind of understand it, they need to be there, but now even my thinking is going, do they need to be there? And actually, for me, we're better off having posters that actually graphically illustrate the negative thoughts we have and how we're going to help each other to manage those negative thoughts. I think we need to do mini group sessions around vulnerability. And I just think we need a shift, a cultural shift in the landscape of how we stretch. How do we stretch people? How do we stretch players to be the best that they can be within our culture? And I think it's nuanced, and I think it's challenging and difficult. And
I don't like nuance, Dan. It's not allowed.
There we go. We don't like nuance, and it's difficult. It's really difficult. And at that level especially, coaches are so socialized into outcome and performance. And I mean, just to hear Scott Parker, as we're speaking yesterday was the player. I mean, I know Scott because I worked at West Ham years ago when he was a player. And just to talk about, did you see that interview with him after the playoff game? And he just talked about, he was quite he's emotional because they've won the game and they're going to the Premier League. It was not yesterday, it was a couple of days ago. But he's saying, you can't enjoy this, and you go home and even if you've won, you can't enjoy it, and you're with your family and you're distracted, and he's in year one of management. He's an absolutely lovely man. He's a great human being, Scott. That's year one. I don't want to talk out of turn because as a sports psychologist I have to recognize ethically I'm not in that environment. I don't know, I'm just going on what he's saying. That's year one of management. So that's unsustainable. If that's his experience, that's unsustainable. So, you've mentioned the word well-being, the well-being of coaches, the well-being of managers. That's a big thing as well. So it's all thrown into the mix. Yeah.
Well,
Good stuff.
yeah, there's so much there, and we could get into, Dan, but I'm wary of time, and I think we're coming to the end. So listen, I would just like to thank you so much. For coming on, and it's been a really fantastic conversation. I've loved, like I say, I feel like you could just maybe we can do another part 2 at some point. But
let's do it.
Really, really great stuff. And would you like to just give a shout to some of the projects you've got going on just now? You've got the Sports Psych podcast as well, you mentioned.
So my podcast is the Sports Psych Show. Which I'm lucky to have good guests on, and just my Twitter handle is at DanAbraham77, and I post a little article each day on my Facebook and LinkedIn. My Facebook is at Dan Abrahams Soccer, and my website is danabrahams.com. But thank you guys. I'd love to do a part 2. I really enjoy having a bit of a deeper dive, and it would be good to we'll get a bit more of a 4-way going next time.
Great insight.
We managed to navigate the disagreeableness of our soon-to-be tech overlords, Dan. So we got to the end.
Before we go, I've got a question for you guys. What have you guys were going to do a dive into critiquing a certain podcast episode?
Yeah.
Have you done that yet?
No, I haven't.
Are you going to do that?
Yeah, I think we will do.
Yeah, we have to.
All right. Well, okay. Well, I won't ask you the question. I just wondered. I don't even know if I've got a question. I'm going to look forward to listening to that. So, yeah.
Well, on that note, thank you very much, Dan Abrahams. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you.